I entered the courtroom and met eyes with the man who had brazenly towed my car yesterday. At that moment, he still didn't know that I was the judge about to hear his case. But when he realized, his face turned as white as chalk. However, what happened next surprised even those who had seen it all. Life in this neighborhood moved at a measured pace. The only conflicts arose during HOA meetings. Elderly women argued over the color of the fence, while the heads of the management company decided which resident would receive a new fine today. Everything remained within the bounds of predictable routine, until one morning began with a loud scandal. The cause of the events, or rather their unwitting victim, was Jonathan Reeves, a man whose name commanded respect in the legal community. A judge whose stern gaze could freeze even the most confident attorneys in a courtroom. He had simply wanted to return home that evening. The day had been long. He had just concluded a hearing that had been a true test of nerves. A group of residents was suing the HOA, accusing the management company of illegal fines and fraudulent car tows. A high-profile case, full of suspicions and shady dealings. To Jonathan, it was yet another example of petty but brazen extortion disguised under legal regulations. As an impartial arbiter, he maintained neutrality until this morning. 23:48. He turned off the engine of his Lexus RX, ran a tired hand over his face, stepped out, and locked the door. The night sky reflected in the windows of the parked cars, and the street was wrapped in silence. Everything was as usual. 07:05. Jonathan opened his apartment door, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and his car keys in the other. His mind was already forming a plan for the day, where to begin his preparation for the next hearing, which details to examine more closely. But when he stepped outside, his car was gone. A second, 2, 3. Sleepiness evaporated as if scalding water had been poured onto his skin. He looked around. Maybe he had parked somewhere else? Could fatigue have made him leave it in a different spot? No. He remembered exactly. The Lexus had been here. But now, in its usual place, nothing. The judge tightened his grip around the key fob. Could it be theft? A step forward. Fresh tire tracks on the asphalt. Not from regular tires, from a tow truck. The realization struck like a thunderclap. No way! But everything pointed to exactly that. He immediately dialed 911. 911, how can I assist you? Good morning. The judge remained calm, but his voice was ice cold. My vehicle is missing from its parking spot near my home. I suspect it was towed. Can you check? On the other end, rapid typing could be heard. Address? Jonathan provided it. More typing. Then the operator's voice became lazier, almost indifferent. Yes, your vehicle was towed. Parking violation. Silence. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. What violation? Common use area. Parked without authorization. Something clicked in his mind. Who requested the tow? Please contact the HOA office, sir. Click. The operator hung up. Jonathan slowly lowered his phone. He knew every law related to parking. This was his domain. Not a single rule prohibited him from parking where he had done so for the past 5 years. HOA. Suddenly, he remembered yesterday's hearing. The residents' lawsuit against the HOA. Unlawful fines. Baseless car removals. And now, his own vehicle was gone. Rage ignited in his chest like a fire roaring to life in a furnace. This was no longer just a case. This was personal, and the HOA would be held accountable for it. The HOA office was in the basement, just like all the shady dealings they were involved in. Jonathan descended the creaky staircase leading to a stuffy, paper-scented room. The corridor was narrow, its walls decorated with yellowed notices bearing headlines like, overdue payment, you could lose your home, and wander less, pay more. He stopped at a door marked HOA Administration, knocked briefly, and walked in without ceremony. Seated behind a desk like a king on his throne was Michael Cassidy, a man in his 50s with slicked-back silver hair and an expression of absolute superiority. His baggy blazer had likely survived more than one scam, and a smug smirk played on his lips. He slowly lifted his head as if taking his time to inspect his visitor, then lazily muttered, "How can I help you?" His tone was as indifferent as a security guard who couldn't care less about who walked into the building. Jonathan clenched his fists. He didn't rush to speak, giving Michael a chance to revel in his illusion of power. "Where's my car?" he asked calmly, but his voice carried a quiet menace. For a split second, interest flickered in Michael's eyes. He raised an eyebrow, like a cheap stage actor feigning exaggerated surprise. "Oh, so it was yours?" His tone was deliberately astonished, as if he had just discovered that fish could swim. "Ah, yes. It was towed this morning." He leaned forward, lazily flipping through a stack of papers. Parking violation, yes. You occupied a common use area without authorization." He slid a printed fine across the desk toward Jonathan. "You'll need to pay the towing fee and the fine now." Jonathan picked up the document and scanned it. Blatant lies. Not only did he have the right to park there, it was legally designated for residents. Moreover, the law was on his side, and he could tear this fine apart in 2 minutes. He looked up. "You do realize you've broken the law?" The judge's voice was calm but glacial. Michael leaned back in his chair and smirked. Folding his arms across his chest, he spoke with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "If you have complaints, sue us." That was when Jonathan's blood boiled. This smug little rat had no idea who was standing in front of him. He had no clue that tomorrow, Jonathan Reeves himself would be presiding over the residents' lawsuit against the HOA. Michael had just dug his own grave. Jonathan slowly placed the fine back on the desk, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Oh, believe me, Michael, I will." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving the HOA chairman blissfully unaware of the storm heading his way. The warm sunset bathed the city in golden hues. But for Jonathan, this day couldn't end fast enough. The barrier at the entrance to the impound lot lifted lazily, granting him entry into the kingdom of bureaucratic absurdity. Hundreds of cars crammed haphazardly together, graffiti-covered walls, the scent of gasoline and rust hanging in the air. Behind the glass of a tiny booth, more like a cage, sat the dispatcher, a man in his 40s with tired eyes, a stretched-out T-shirt, and an expression of absolute indifference to other people's problems. "Name?" he muttered without looking up. "Reeves. Jonathan Reeves. Lexus RX." The dispatcher tapped sluggishly on the keyboard. $500 for towing, $100 for storage. He turned the screen, where a bold $600 flashed. Jonathan stared at him. $500 for what? Towing. On what grounds? Request from the HOA. The HOA has no legal right to tow lawfully parked vehicles. The dispatcher shrugged. "I just work here, sir. Pay now, or we'll start charging $50 for each additional day." The indifferent tone. The familiar scheme. A system that ran flawlessly because the people trapped in it had no way to fight back. But Jonathan wasn't just any man. He exhaled slowly. "No, I won't pay. They will." Turning on his heel, he walked out, leaving the dispatcher to stare blankly after him. The car would stay here tonight. Tomorrow, he would take matters into his own hands. The courtroom was packed the next day. The residents filled the front rows, their faces tense with anticipation. They had fought this battle for months, hoping the court would finally bring justice. At the long table sat the HOA representatives, calm, even smug. They knew the game well. Connections, bureaucracy, and expensive lawyers had saved them before. Michael Cassidy, confident in his untouchability, exchanged a few words with his attorney and smirked. They thought the outcome was already decided, that the judge would be just another official they could persuade, intimidate, or confuse. But then, the courtroom doors opened. Jonathan Reeves walked in. The silence struck like lightning. Michael Cassidy and his lawyer froze. Their faces stretched in horror, like gamblers suddenly realizing they had bet everything on a losing hand. "What the?" Michael started, but the words died in his throat as his eyes met the judge's. Panic. Now he knew who would be delivering the verdict. Jonathan took his seat calmly, casting a brief glance at the HOA representatives before shifting his attention to the case file in front of him. The room was deathly quiet. Placing his hands on the desk, he spoke evenly. "Gentlemen, before we proceed with today's case, I need to clarify something." He leaned back, interlocked his fingers, and fixed Michael Cassidy with a piercing gaze. "Michael Cassidy, as the HOA representative, can you explain on what grounds your board had my vehicle towed yesterday morning?" For a moment, absolute silence filled the room. Cassidy swallowed hard. A murmur rippled through the crowd, residents, attorneys, even the court staff, all realizing the magnitude of the moment. The HOA president was trapped. They thought they could bully an ordinary resident, but they had touched a judge. And now, justice was coming for them. What began as a routine bureaucratic dispute had turned into a public execution by noon. One by one, the pieces of evidence landed on the table like nails being hammered into the HOA's coffin. Jonathan Reeves wasn't just presiding over a case. He was dismantling the entire scheme that Michael Cassidy had been running for years. Document after document, testimony after testimony. The financial report? Forged. Parking fines? Extortion. The towing company? Owned by Michael Cassidy's cousin. The courtroom was silent as a grave. Cassidy sat hunched over, sweat glistening on his forehead. His lawyer was whispering frantically in his ear, but the HOA president already knew. There was no way out. He had lost. When Jonathan called the first witnesses, residents whose cars had been towed under identical false pretenses and held for ransom, the case became irreversible. Shouts, outraged voices. People stood up, waving documents, presenting photos, playing recorded calls where they had been threatened with fines for daring to park near their own homes. And then Jonathan played his final card. "Your Honor." He turned the last page of the case file. "In light of the presented evidence, it is clear that Michael Cassidy and his team have spent years using illegal fines, threats, and fraudulent towing schemes to enrich themselves at the expense of the residents." He turned to Cassidy. "The irony? Yesterday, they tried to pull the same scam on me." Laughter rippled through the courtroom, not the light-hearted kind, but cold and contemptuous. The consequences were inevitable. The court's ruling landed like a hammer striking an anvil. The HOA was ordered to compensate all residents for illegal fines and towing fees. Michael Cassidy was immediately removed from his position. A criminal case was opened against him for fraud and abuse of power. The unlawful parking regulations used for extortion were voided. Each word from the judge was a nail in Michael Cassidy's career and reputation. His face turned pale, then red. His fingers gripped the edge of the table as if trying to cling to a ledge. But the fall was too steep. When the hearing ended, the courtroom erupted in applause. Residents hugged each other, shook Jonathan's hand. People who had been bullied and robbed for years had finally received justice. And Cassidy sat there like a shattered statue as court officers prepared to escort him out. But before leaving, Jonathan did one last thing. He walked over to Michael Cassidy, who now looked small, pathetic. The smug smirk was gone. Cassidy lifted his eyes, the eyes of a man who had just realized he had destroyed himself. Jonathan leaned in. "I'm taking your advice, Michael." He paused, letting the moment sink in. "If you have complaints, sue me." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Cassidy sitting among the ruins of his empire of greed. The HOA thought they were untouchable. They forgot the one rule of the game: never cross the man who delivers justice.